So I like to break it down, like you said, in terms that people can totally understand without getting too technical. I've done this presentation. I mean, I've talked about SB4D and 154 in front of the Florida Bar Committee, in front of, Broward County Housing Council a lot, but I've also just talked about it on my podcast. And of course, I talk about it with my clients. So however you want to break it down, let's do it.
Yeah, so that's why I said, okay, let's get into the questions and let's get it to more like, I'm the condo homeowner. I'm wondering, like, how is this going to affect me? In the future, like literally, like I don't really care about all the minutia on the inspections. I care about kind of what is the end result? Like, how is that going to affect me? So that's why I said, so okay, so just so people know who you are, so you are Donna Berger. You are with, is it Becker and Polyakov or Becker and Polyakov?
Okay, so both wrong. So I go with Donna DiMaggio Berger.
Okay.
And the firm name has been shortened from Becker and Polyakov to Becker.
Oh,
so we did our brand.
Oh, so I don't have to remember how to say that anymore.
You don't. Donna DiMaggio Berger at Becker. Yep.
DiMaggio. I forgot about the DiMaggio. I should not forget about that. So DiMaggio.
How do you forget about the Joe DiMaggio part?
I know. Okay. So, and your firm, I think, is one of the top I didn't say which state, but I'm pretty sure in Florida, one of the top community association law firms in the state of Florida, right?
So in Florida, Melissa, we are actually the oldest and the largest. So we represent more than 5,000 associations throughout Florida, and we just celebrated our 50th anniversary. So,
wow. Well, congrats. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We have offices in New York, New Jersey, DC, and I think we're in Southern Philadelphia now too.
Oh, right. Expanding. Are they going to expand even more across the country? Is that the goal?
Well, my goal was to get us to my hometown, Chicago, but we'll see if that. But yeah, we're always looking out for potential markets that would fit with our business model.
Nice. So when SB4D first passed, like you and I worked together, I was on the board here at the Berkeley South where I own my office condo. I was director and then vice president and then president. And so I had a lot of knowledge about construction because we're obviously going through a lot of construction here. We also went through inspections, all of that stuff, dealing with engineers, dealing with architects. So when SB4D first passed, I was completely freaked out because when I saw it, I'm like,
you and a lot of people. Yeah.
I'm like, does everybody know what this means? Like, this is a big deal. I'm like, if you have a $20 million, reserve study, then you have to have all that money on January 1st, 2025, so that's the way I understood it. Right. And me not having a legal background, I didn't have the forethought to think, oh, well, they're going to fix the bill. They're going to come out and fix it. So I went to your YouTube and I started watching some of the different ones and then watching and trying to get a better understanding. And I'm like, oh, okay. So they're hoping that this is going to be corrected because we can't just have all these condos fail and put everyone on the street. So, and then game glitch bill, SB 154. So, but on SB 4D, what was your first thought? What were you thinking when you saw it come out?
So my first thought was that if it's done correctly, it could result in Florida having the safest housing stock in the country, which would be huge and it would be incredibly positive. But remember, I said if done correctly. Now, I don't know, Melissa, if you know my background, but I was a lobbyist for years going up to Tallahassee to work on association issues. So one of the things I'm cognizant of is that legislation is a very incremental process. So, they used to say you take little bites at the apple and the whole apple's eaten. I knew when 4D came out, specifically because remember, it came out in special session. After Champlain Towers, the Florida legislature closed the session without passing any safety reforms. And then, of course, people were like, how is that possible? They went back into special session. And I think in the span of 72 hours, they hammered out SB 4D. which was the first legislation post Champlain Towers collapse. Now, in 72 hours, you're not going to address everything. And so, you know, as I said, it's an incremental process. We knew there would have to be a glitch bill because there were so many questions left unanswered with 4D. And also there was a very real supply and demand issue. I think there's millions of people, you know, the Florida Bar did a study on this, but there's millions of people living in Florida condo units that are 30 years old or older. So that was always going to be the problem with 4D. It was the first step. And even with this glitch bill, Melissa, it's not the last step. And I know we're going to talk about that.
Yeah. So you knew because of your background that, okay, they're going to fix this. It might not be perfect, but they're going to fix this. This is the first run out of the gate. Because my first videos on this, if you see them, are like, oh my God. And I totally feel the same as you. We needed legislation. We needed inspections. I heard that Broward and Miami were the only counties with 40 and 50-year inspections on condos because we have the oldest condos. I understand that. But I'm like, really? No one else in the entire state had those inspections? Wow. So we obviously need this. And hopefully it just keeps evolving or getting iterated into something that makes sense. All right, so SB 154 came out, and this was the glitch bill. Now you call it the glitch bill on your channel and like in an email that you sent out. Is that literally the name? Is it glitch bill SB 154?
Oh no, it is SB 154. We do call it a glitch bill, and frankly, its scope, Melissa, goes so far beyond what a glitch bill is. Typically, a glitch bill is, you know, we've changed one little thing in the statute and you haven't looked elsewhere in the statute and it's a technicality we need to fix, hence the name glitch. Yeah. 154 went a lot further than just fixing little technicalities. And again, what happens is, and I give you like a little insider's viewpoint to what goes on in Senate bill drafting. You know, legislators have 6 bill slots and, you know, they put it into bill drafting, they know what they want to do, and it comes out, and I've said this before, like Frankenstein's monster. You're like, okay, but you've changed this section and you haven't changed that section. And both 4D and 154, they've addressed numerous statutes, okay? So it's not just, we call it the glitch bill, but again, it goes far beyond just a technical fix.
Yeah, they did fix some of the big expenses. I know, I think, at least with the reserves, I think that was one of the biggest ones. And I guess, so my first question is, and I think a lot of condo owners, so in the past, the way that it's worked, and I know all buildings are different and you can't make a blanket statement for everything, but let's just say most of them, I think most of them, they vote, depending on what their documents say, on whether they're going to have full reserves, no reserves, or partial reserves, right? Is that?
Well, no, not necessarily. So let's just take co-ops, okay? We'll leave HOAs off to the side because they're a different beast. Right. If you want to bring them in, we'll talk about it. But right now, we're going to talk about condominiums and cooperatives. So for years, condominium and cooperative boards have been required under the law to propose a budget with full reserves for painting, paving, roof, and any other item for which the deferred maintenance or replacement cost exceeds $10,000. That's a pretty low threshold, but typically that's for elevators or seawall. And then of course, some communities have reserved for everything, lobby furniture and this and all of that. But let's just stick with the basics. So boards, even before Champlain Towers and SB 4D, had to propose a budget with full reserves. Now, the members had the right to vote to waive those reserves or to partially fund them, okay? But here's kind of the wrinkle. The association did not have to make it easy for members to do that. So I had some communities that they never put that out to the vote, and their budgets went into effect with what they thought were fully funded reserves. Now, it used to be a majority of those members present and voting could vote to waive reserves. SB 154 raised that threshold to a majority of all the members. So that's the first big ticket item for your listeners to understand, is that even if you're fewer than 3 stories, because a lot of what we're talking about today impacts what we call threshold buildings, 3 stories or higher. But even if you're 2 stories, like your 2-story villas, attached townhomes, whatever it may be, your threshold for your members to waive reserves or partially fund reserves has been increased to a majority of the total membership.
Oh, which is nearly impossible. So we know.
Well, I don't know. You know, I think this, Melissa, you can do it by proxy, and a lot more people are offering online voting, right? And frankly, when it comes to a vote about reserves, people are pretty motivated because normally you send out 2 budgets, right? One with full reserves and one with partial reserves. And you look at it and they go, oh, my assessments will be less with partial reserves.
Right.
So that's a really easy vote to get. I don't think anybody should be waiving reserves at this point, even if you're under the threshold. It just doesn't make sense, because I know you're in the real estate industry. You know that purchasers are becoming more sophisticated, and
Right.
lenders are becoming more stringent, as are insurance companies.
Yeah, we're analyzing. I mean, as realtors, so we've been doing our job trying to inform people about everything that's going on. But we're, for our buyers and our buyers especially, we're really looking at this and saying, okay, let's look at this building. Let's say, have they had any assessments recently? Do they have one on the table? Does it look like they need a lot of work? Have they done concrete restoration? What are their last jobs they've done? And that's how where before we really didn't do that. We really looked at, do they have an assessment? Oh my God, they have an assessment. We're going to have to negotiate that. Now we're like, great, they have an assessment. Actually, they have an assessment because they took a loan so they can fund the reserves. That's fantastic. So now we're like happy to see that they're making these moves to be funded. One of the big things that I thought, so they can, one of the ways they can fund their full reserves, if they feel like they need to, they can go get a loan, right? And do.
Well, let's talk about you
Yeah.
put a lot on the table there. So
Yeah,
let's take a step back. That's okay. But what's fully funded, first of all? What does it mean to have fully funded reserves? So it means, okay. So it means that you have to follow the statutory formula of calculating what the estimated remaining useful life, let's take the roof. How many years left do we have on this roof? What's it going to cost? Let's say you got 10 years left. What's it going to cost at the end of 10 years to replace that roof? And then you're setting aside money each year until hopefully the end of that useful life for that component. Now, I ask a lot of clients, and this came up with 4D when you said the panic, everybody was panicking, and a few clients were like, oh, we haven't reserved, we've waived reserves for decades, so they were panicking. I had a few other clients that were like, oh, we've got this, we're fully funded. Okay, how long ago was your reserve study done? 7 years ago. Did you have an inflationary factor? No, you are not even close to being fully funded. So, now one of the things that 154 did, Senate Bill 154, is they said you can add an inflationary factor. So your reserve companies will likely, when they're doing what we call SIRS, the acronym for Structural Integrity Reserve Study, is they will be adding in an inflationary factor. I know you only have to do it under the law every 10 years, but I really urge associations to do reserve studies more frequently, because things change, right? We're in South Florida, and we're in the middle of hurricane season. And September and October, these are the most active months. If a hurricane comes through, your estimated remaining useful life for your building may be completely different now. So that's number one, is make sure you're on top of the reserve studies and you're doing them more frequently. Now, you asked about funding. And I'm so glad you asked that, because this really does play into potential purchasers and when they're making that purchase decision in the building. Reserves, by their very nature, are meant to be funded by the budget. That's why when the board passes the budget, they must attach that reserve schedule, right?
Yeah.
What's happening though is that in an attempt to kind of keep the assessments lower, and we see this with developers artificially keeping their budgets lower to make themselves marketable, they are not funding reserves through the budget, and they are instead passing special assessments. Now, I keep telling clients this can be a really significant problem because you may be acquiring new purchasers who are looking at the numbers, and in their minds, they're thinking that this budget is pretty fixed, right? This is, I can just make this. Maybe they've got a 5% cushion without thinking, there may be a series of special assessments, big ones, right around the corner. So one thing I would suggest for potential purchasers is you have to look at that structural integrity reserve study, see what it's calling for, and look at the budget. If those numbers do not line up, that means there's a bunch of special assessments, either for the projects themselves. I just had this in a community where the CSRS came out and they said, you have 0 remaining useful life on painting and roof. 0, which means you have to fund it now. That community was being recommended, they were recommended to have a $2.5 million special assessment. There were only 36 units in that building. So you can do the math.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So on the CSRS, I had a question about that. So we used to have the 10-year reserve study, and those did not have to be done by licensed engineers or architects. SB 4D changed that. SB 154 kept it. It didn't change it. So they do have to be done. Well, I guess my question is, does CSRS replace the 10-year reserve study? Is this now the 10-year reserve study?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So CSRS is going to replace it, but remember, SB 4D said that visual inspection under CSRS had to be conducted by a licensed architect or engineer. 154 changed that because they wanted to address the supply-demand problems we identified, and now a reserve specialist certified under CAI or other certification can conduct the visual inspection. So that opens up the field to more people being able to conduct a CSRS.
Yeah, because all the buildings wouldn't have been able to get it done before the deadline, at least the visual inspection, right? I had a question about, so we talked about the way that Miami and Broward had their inspections, but the other counties in the state didn't necessarily have that. And I noticed SB 154 put a lot of stuff back on the local authorities. But if they're not skilled in this, like our local authorities are, like, what are you anticipating? What do you think about that? Like, do you think they can handle it?
I have very strong feelings on this question. And I'll tell you why. Again, my background. And I've been watching the trends coming out of Tallahassee. What's so surprising to me, because you're right, 154, one of the huge takeaways is that our state government punted to local government and said basically now, hey, local building department officials can give you more time to complete milestone and CSRS. They can give you less time. If you're making good faith efforts, maybe you'll have more time. If they think you're particularly vulnerable, they'll give you less time. This is very interesting because the trend, Melissa, the last few years has been Tallahassee preempting everything, saying, we want to have the last say on Airbnb and short-term rentals and a host of other things. But on this particular thing, they've said, no, we think local government has got it. So that's interesting. To your point, Florida has 67 counties. Miami-Dade and Broward were the only 2 out of 67 counties that had a certification requirement for older buildings to try to confirm that their structural integrity of those older buildings remain sound. The good news is that now it's statewide, right? And by the way, we're not the only counties that have high rises. Tampa, St. Pete, there's high rises everywhere, all along in Naples and Fort Myers. We've got them everywhere. So that's the good news. Do I worry about disparity depending on where you live? Absolutely. We saw that back in the days. Remember the fire sprinkler issue? And the retro for sprinklers, and then it was engineered life safety systems, and we're still contending with that.
It was up to the fire chief, and the fire chief has a different opinion at every location, and there were no solid, like, this is what you have to do.
Correct. You are exactly right. So what happened is if you were in a geographic location where your local fire marshal was pretty well stocked, your ELSS or engineered life safety system requirements might look a lot different than somebody in another county where that local fire marshal's department was not well stocked. So now you may have had to pay for two-way radios and other things and communications. So I hope we're not going back to the days where it's, it's a roll of the dice depending on, which county you live in.
Yeah, that was my concern when I saw that they were pushing it back on the local authorities, because here we have the engineers, the inspectors that work for the cities and the counties, and they're used to doing this stuff. So they're well versed in doing this. But if they haven't been doing it in these other counties, how suddenly are they going to make this happen? So I guess that's just something.
Can I also just add to my little mini rant about the Florida legislature this session with 154 is that it is somewhat mind-boggling that, listen, we continue to have our legislature pile things onto associations, both the boards and the residents, right? But we know that a building that has a significant construction defect, it's almost impossible to recover from that unless the developer makes it right. And what the legislature continues to do is chip away at consumers' rights to go after developers for construction defects. So what'll happen over time, and again, we're talking about older buildings, right? Older buildings, once that building's occupied, and it's been occupied for decades, it's very hard to detect at that point a construction defect, especially if it's subsurface. But even if you did detect it, the statute of limitations now has been shortened so significantly that being able to go after the developer isn't an option. So it's just yet another cost piled onto the backs of the unit owners in these communities.
That in there, how do they get that in those bills so that it protects them even
really
more?
Good lobbying.
Seems the opposite of, like, after Champlain, that should be the last thing that we're doing is releasing liability sooner.
And shortening the statute of limitations for latent defects, which are defects you can't see with your eye. And you know why this is important, not only for new construction, but we have all these older buildings you and I are talking about right now that are going to be spending tens and hundreds of millions of dollars on concrete restoration projects, on their balconies, on their buildings, on their building envelope. If there's any defective work being done, the boards and members might not know for years, and by the time they discover it, because the legislature keeps passing bills that shorten these statutes of limitations, they may be out of luck, which means, again, on the one hand, the Florida legislature is saying to all these associations, hey, you got to do the engineering, you've got to put money aside to pay for these projects, you have to do these projects within a defined period of time. But by the way, if you drew the short straw and got a bad contractor, your problem. I mean, it is really mind-boggling.
How does that happen? I know how it happens, but it's unfortunate that it's actually still happening.
And we know that there's contractors listen, there's some contractors and developers that do amazing work, and there's some that do terrible work. And that's another thing. How do boards, some boards are more sophisticated and more adept at vetting contractors than others. Sometimes they're going slowly by price and they're taking the lowest bid.
I know, I have experience with that. I have experience with that. Okay, so you said a word in your last statement that I wanted to address because it's confusing for me and I don't know how it's going to be addressed. And you said the building envelope. How are we handling the windows? Because that's a big deal in a condo.
So this, I hope in your series you've interviewed some engineers, because
next. So next will be my engineers, my architects, my mortgage people, my everything else, so we can go through this process. But so that's really an engineering question, Melissa, because some engineers will tell you that yes, windows are structural, and some will tell you they're not. Now remember, both SB 4D and 154 talking about stairs, you got to put away for structural components, right? Columns, the structure. They remove the word flooring, but structure is basically everything. Yeah. What 154 did clarify, 4D talked about putting aside money for windows in addition to electrical, plumbing, roof, waterproofing, all of that stuff. 154 took that out, and they basically said items for which the association bears maintenance responsibility. So in some, right.
So in some communities, it's the owners who are responsible for the windows.
Yeah.
So in that, the association wouldn't be reserving. But again, there's always common area windows and common area doors. So you
Yeah.
have to take that into account. And I would say this, I know this is not about the insurance crisis. This is about the safety legislation, but they are connected. Okay. So that you could do a whole series on just that alone. They're connected. And if there are associations listening that still have like some windows that have impact glass and other windows that don't, then they need to talk to council about passing a statutory membership vote for them to install windows as a common expense. Because they're probably going to need that to get insurance anyhow.
Yeah, that's what I think we're seeing in some of the buildings that we're in, is it's just going to happen. But when SB 4D came out, I was concerned about that because the windows are not always the responsibility of the association. And
Right.
usually, well, what I've seen, it's a lot of times the owner's responsibility. So I'm like, what are they gonna force the whole building? Is the whole building gonna pay to replace those owners that haven't replaced their windows yet? Like, how exactly would that work? But I see
So
now that
that's actually a really easy solution to that. That was already in the statute. So if this is a condominium, Melissa, you can take that vote, a majority membership vote to have the association install impact glass. They can pass a special assessment. Any unit that already has the impact glass would get a credit. So only the people whose units need to have the impact glass would wind up paying. By the way, I want to make sure people understand I'm not giving specific legal advice to your association if they're listening. So run it by your own counsel.
and that accounts for from the beginning of the the recorded.
Yes. This is retroactive application. Yes.
This is conversation for entertainment. No, we need to know these things, and people need it at a level that they can. And I'm not saying that people are not smart enough to get it. It just gets so technical when you're reading the bills that you're like, okay, but how is this going to affect me? So we talked about inflation, being able to put in the inflation cost, or an estimation of what that would be for, let's say they're doing their SIR study, they've added in, they figure out what it's going to cost in the next 10 years and at what point they're going to need those funds. They've put an inflation rate in there. But now those studies are being done by licensed professionals. And before this, they were not. So I would imagine that their quantities and their estimations are going to be much higher than they have been in the past. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or am I just worried?
No, I think that is listen, you're right. For the vast majority of associations, they did not hire reserve companies. It was Fred, the treasurer, who was pulling numbers out of the air or talking to the roof or what have you. I actually think that this is a really positive development, that you've got a company that you're working with, because if they make a mistake, then there's potential to go after them for professional liability. By the way, don't try to do your reserves using ChatGPT. Okay, there's no recourse against ChatGPT if you try to use them. Do I think the numbers are going to go up? Yes, I think in the post-Champlain Towers landscape that people are just more conservative, right? I think that they're going to want to make sure that they're covering everything. Now, what's really interesting, and you didn't ask me this, but it ties into your question, is I'm seeing some communities where they want a peer review, right? Like for either the milestone inspection or the SIRS, they're like, we want a do-over. We don't believe this. We don't, and it's not normally the board, it's normally driven by the members. So once they get the report, they're like, these people are being ridiculous. They're requiring us to put aside too much money. We don't agree with them. So then the question becomes, oh, can you get a second opinion? Let's take milestone inspections. My suggestion is this: peer reviews, meaning you're getting another company to come in and give you like a second opinion if you go to the doctor, right? But you want a more robust opinion. Like if your first engineer only looked at 12 balconies out of 200, yeah, maybe you want to say, you know what, we need to get a peer review and we need to have 50% of the balconies inspected. But there's a lot of people saying, they inspected, 100 balconies. We only need 3, and we want these 3 inspected. So you see where I'm going with this, right?
Everyone figures out a way to game the system. Well, not everyone, but the people who want to, they find a way, right? But then if you have 2 milestone inspections and they're different, which one stands?
Well, here's the thing. I've actually talked to building officials. In the old days, remember when only Miami-Dade and Broward had the certifications, the engineers would send the 40 and 50-year certification reports directly to the boards. And in some cases, boards would do absolutely nothing with them, or they would sit on them for months or what have you. Now those reports go directly to the local authority.
Yeah.
So I will tell you, if you send in, and you have no choice, you cannot instruct your engineer not to send it in, which you should not have been doing anyhow. It's
right.
there. Now you try to come up with another report that's less robust. And I can tell you that the local authorities, again, people are more conservative, more likely to go with the more rigorous report.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially maybe, yes, of course. No, it totally makes sense. Okay. So that solves that problem. So the windows, we've taken care of that. And then what do you think, in terms of the buyers? We've been telling our clients for 2 years to look for buildings that have work happening. So we talked about that a little bit. A history of work happening and partial and full reserves. So is there other things that you think as agents, and I know this isn't what you do, but you probably have some green flag, red flag stuff that you think about. If you were buying a condo, what would you be looking for?
Ooh, so if I was buying a condo, again, the budget tells a lot. Now, a potential purchaser cannot just say, hey, I want to see the budget. But their owner who's selling the unit to him or her can certainly do that. So again, looking at the budget, look and see what has been accounted for in terms of bad debt, right? That will take bad debt. Normally, if they don't have a bad debt line item on the budget, they should have a bad debt line item, because it's virtually impossible to guarantee you're going to collect 100% of the assessments. So what does the delinquency issue look like in this building? Looking at the milestone inspection, looking at the SIRS will help. I think most potential purchasers, for them, it's the most significant purchase, Melissa, in their life. And I would really urge them to have their own attorney look at this stuff. I used to be a commercial and residential real estate attorney before going in representing associations. And I was kind of shocked that, people were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, and they don't have their own attorney looking this over, particularly when you're buying in a mandatory community association. There are rules and regulations you are going to have to follow from day one. And if this is not a good fit for you, you need to know about it before you sign, before you close. So I would say have an attorney look over for you and summarize what the restrictions are. Also, in a condo, there's a document called the Frequently Asked Questions and Answer Sheet. Are you familiar with that one? Yeah. So, and guess what? A lot of associations don't know about it. You should ask for it. Can I get a copy of the FAQ? That's in a condo. That FAQ is more than a half dozen questions. It tells you how much the assessments are, what the major use restrictions are, like no leasing for the first year, or you can only lease one time a year, no commercial vehicles. It'll also tell you if the association is involved in any litigation costing in excess of $100,000. I want to know that too. Is this a highly litigious community? Like, you could, again, if you had an attorney assisting you, you could have that attorney do a civil court docket search and see how many times that association has sued or been sued. So I think there's a lot of things that a potential purchaser can do to kind of figure out if this community is the right fit.
Right. That was a good one. The FAQs, and then, so I'm going to go back and watch our interview later and take all my notes. Although I know it's not legal advice. So, okay. So one of the other things for, that our condo writer in real estate now says that the buyer has a right to the SIRS study. So let's say that now. And if they don't have it done yet, then the board or the association has to provide a letter to the buyer stating that they haven't done it. And I think that's to avoid maybe a seller hiding it.
Okay.
Like, right? I mean, I would imagine that that's why it came into play. So, but I think there's a lot of agents that really don't know that they can ask for that SIRS. So I think it's a good thing in the end, but I don't know. Have you seen a SIRS report yet?
I've
I
seen lots.
assume you have.
I've seen lots, and I'm getting them all the time, and
Yeah.
it's a lot of billing. I will tell you that. I'll say, do you really want me? Because I'm not a reserve specialist, but they want me to take a look at it. I mean, first of all, to your point, people need to know they're entitled to this, right? That they're entitled to it. Now, if the association doesn't have it ready, and it's the same thing for the developer. The developer has deadlines for these reports, and sometimes with somebody closing with the developer, they're not going to have this done. Both the developer and the post-transition association are going to have to say, hey, we don't have this done, right? That does not necessarily mean that they're in violation. Remember, I talked a few minutes ago about the fact that the local authority may have given them an extension.
Right.
So they may have said, hey, you have more time to do this. So don't automatically assume that if you get a letter saying we don't have this done yet, that means they're automatically in violation. They may have been given an extension of time by the local authority. So you have to ask.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't even think about the fact that the local authorities, I keep thinking about the deadline, December 31st, 2024, but that could change now that other people are in charge. So on the SIRS, if I haven't had one yet, I haven't even seen one yet. So is it something, if I give to my buyer, like, is it something that we can look at? Is it simple to look at? Because before we didn't really know what the future expected costs were for a building.
Yeah, here's the thing. In the past, people were looking at what? The view's great. The layout of the unit is great. Yeah, I really like the location. People weren't thinking about, well, is there an emergency generator in this building? How old is the roof? Do we have fully funded reserves? What does the insurance coverage look like? Actually, let me take a step back. Potential purchaser, the insurance coverage. So right now, you've got a lot of communities that are deciding that they need or want to underinsure the property. And some are even talking about self-insuring because they cannot afford these astronomical increases in insurance premiums. So that is going to, if it were me looking to purchase, I want to know, what's the insurance situation look like? Who's the carrier? What's the deductible? And what's the replace? Are you fully insuring for replacement value? I mean, your beautiful unit doesn't mean anything if the building gets potentially significantly damaged and there's not enough insurance to rebuild to the same spec. That's a problem. Insurance is a huge factor. That could be a whole separate interview talking about that.
We'll eventually have to do one on insurance. I'm just trying to get through all of Florida condo safety law first, and then I'll say, okay, let's go back and let's talk about flood insurance for condominiums and regular insurance because it's gone crazy. So, okay, so when I'm wrapping this up a little bit. So when SB 4D came out, my heart was broken for the older communities that are 55 and up, that you have a lot of people on fixed incomes. Those units are probably worth $100,000. We're not talking big money here, maybe 70, 80,000. They haven't really kept up with their maintenance. Those were a concern. And a lot of them are west, and a lot of them sit on big acreage, right? So prime for development. Now, I believe in both of these bills. I know that it will get better over time. I know it's never perfect. At the end of the day, there's always unintended consequences. But I think condos will be safer. And then, just like you said, right from the beginning, at the end of the day, we will have the safest condos in the entire US, maybe everywhere, because we're going to be so strict about it. But there is going to be some casualties of war. So, and I think some buildings are going to fail. I do get calls now from elderly people that are stressed. Some have decided to sell and move with family members out of state, consolidate, go north, different things. But there are some that just don't have that option. Maybe it's health, maybe whatever, but they know that the building is about to have a lot of problems because they already know that they haven't been repairing it, and they're starting to get hit with insurance assessments right now. And they haven't even been hit with what's going to come whenever their SERS is done and everything else. So, do you see, percentage wise, you as a company, do you guys have an idea of how many buildings or types of buildings will be affected? And I assume that developers will be standing by waiting for opportunity.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I have an upcoming podcast episode on condo terminations and co-op sales. So yes, we will see, Melissa, some communities where people make the decision, hey, you know what, we're not going to be able to afford to continue to live here, all of us, or the vast majority of us. And it might make sense because a lot of these older buildings in particular are situated along the coast, and they were marketed as Florida's affordable piece of paradise. Maybe you can't own that mansion on the ocean, but you can get your condo or co-op unit. And now what we're seeing, decades later, is it's only going to be for the very wealthy in some of these buildings along the coastline. So yes, I absolutely think, and I also think the state of Florida overall is going to see a huge decrease in the number of people deciding to retire down here.
Right.
Because of the insurance crisis, because of these issues with multifamily buildings and all of the requirements, the engineering and the reserve funding. And I'm not saying the requirements are bad, but I'm saying they are definitely going to be a factor in terms of, do I want to retire in Florida, or do I want to go to Arizona, or do I want to go to Costa Rica, or do I want to go somewhere else where my money is going to go further? I do think that a lot of the other counties should be looking at what Miami-Dade County has done, which is they passed they have this fund they created. I think it was originally 9.2 million, and 5.5 million has already been earmarked, but it is money that people living in older buildings, it's called a special assessment fund, who get a large special assessment to maintain their building, can take out a loan, and I think it's an interest-free loan for as long as 40 years.
Wow.
Yes. Now, a lot's going to depend on how much is in that pot and how quickly it gets gobbled up. But Miami-Dade is doing it. And again, they've already gotten hundreds of people that have applied and have been granted this money to help them pay and afford the special assessments that are coming. So I don't see why other counties can't look to see what Miami-Dade is doing and try to do something similar to help people in these buildings.
Yeah, because I don't think we want the buildings to be safe. We don't necessarily want to displace all these people who really don't have a place to go and don't have the extra funds to fund something like this. But there is going to be a transition period. I think it's going to be the next 2 years are going to be the biggest. I felt like mid to end of 2024, what we're talking about right now, everyone else is going to start to understand, because they're going to just feel it a lot more as those fees get higher, as they start to see everything coming in, especially.
You know this better than I do, Melissa, because this, you help people find new homes, right? And I'm sure you helped young couples buy their starter home, but they don't stay in the starter home forever. Then they move up to the larger home. You've helped people like me who've raised their families, and then they're empty nesters, leave their big homes and downsize. And what may happen in some of these cases is you've got people, like you said, on fixed incomes who say, you know what, coastal living in a condo unit is no longer for us. It's just another housing option. Maybe we move inland. Maybe we may move north in the state. Maybe we move to a little sleepy beach town where costs are lower. So it really is, this is not the only time in somebody's life where a housing option no longer works for them, for their lifestyle.
Right. And we're seeing a different market shift where we haven't seen before. And I think it's partially due to COVID, but also because of the expenses. So what we're seeing is people getting into their, what I'm noticing is it's late 70s, 80s and up. And instead of just staying put at their place here in Florida, they're deciding to sell, and they're going back to the colder temperatures where their family members are, because they're looking for that family dynamic. They want to be closer to family. They want to spend more time with family, and they need maybe a little bit more assistance now. I mean, just, or they know they're coming into that time in their life when they're going to need that. And obviously you're seeing consolidation of family members now just because the cost of housing in general, and that is a whole other.
Yeah, I gotta get you on the podcast because I want to talk about intergenerational living and whether
Yes.
that's taking
Yes.
off.
Yes, and ADUs. So we can get into that and talk about ADUs because I think that is a solution. And although the state has its guidelines, we probably need a little bit more push from
Right.
county cities to help that out. And an accessory dwelling unit is what an ADU is for the people watching, and it just means,
Or a granny flat, right? Don't you also
Yeah.
call it?
yeah, granny flat. Exactly. So is there anything you want to add? Is there something I did want to ask? Do you think that we will have another bill?
Oh yeah, there's always unintended consequences. Well, you asked, are we going to have another bill? I hope we're going to have another bill because one of the things you asked me is how do we fund all these reserves? And in SB 154, they allowed a multi-condominium association, which is a condo association that operates more than 25 associations, subs, to allow to substitute a line of credit instead of the reserves as an alternate funding resource. Now, there's only one community in the entire state that actually qualifies as that, and that's because they once again had a really good lobbyist who snuck that in the bill. I don't want to say snuck, put it in the bill. So we're hoping that next year the legislature is going to extend that option to all affected buildings, all affected thresholds, to say, look, we don't want to fund, we want to keep the assessments a little bit lower, but what if we get a line of credit or a loan? Can we use that instead to show you that we've got the resources necessary to make these maintenance and repair projects? So that would be one thing. If we're wrapping up, here's what I would say, Melissa. First of all, one of the problems for my owners is there's a lot of arguing right now about the right thing to do in the building, right? So we've got people with generational differences. We've got people with cultural differences. We've got investor owners versus people living there. Everybody has their own opinion, okay? Some people, I had one guy say, you know what, those repairs on the roof should be $12,000. They were about a $1.5 million replacement. But this man was adamant that a $12,000 and a hammer and some tar and you could get it done. If you're living in a building, you have to kind of adjust your mindset. You have to understand that keeping your resale value up doesn't just depend on the improvements you're making inside your unit. Okay, it's not just about renovating your kitchen and your bathroom. It's about keeping the building up overall, that the structural integrity remains sound, that the roof is going to not leak, that the windows are going to work, that you're not going to have constant moisture intrusion, and you're not going to have mold proliferating throughout the building. That's for my purchasers. Just know that the quality of your lifestyle and the value of your unit depends on more than just your four walls, okay? For my board members, I would say, look, it's never been harder to serve on the board. You're not going to be popular. You've got unpopular decisions to make, but you have to be willing to make them, particularly because you are potentially personally liable if you don't meet these deadlines and you don't do the right thing when it comes to the inspections, the engineering reports, and the structural integrity reserve study. So, if you don't think you can do that, don't get on the board.
Know where you stand on that when it comes to being on a board, because the board, and I know that is one of your soapboxes, and you're like, these board members are volunteers. They're living in the building. They were like PE teachers their entire life. Nothing against PE teachers, but they weren't working in structural or construction or contracts or anything. And all of a sudden we're going to make them personally liable. Nobody's going to want to be on the board.
And I say that having been on my own HOA board for 2 years and having to sit up there and be like, I know I'm one of the few association attorneys, because I asked them, like, have you been on your board? They're like, oh no, I don't even go to the meetings. I was on the board and I know what that's like, where you have to look out at your neighbors and make those tough decisions. And then the last thing I would say, because I hear this a lot, Melissa, from investor owners, when you are calculating your potential return on investment in Florida, the particularly in an older building, you have to factor in maintenance and repair costs. I think a lot of investor owners in the past have not factored in ongoing maintenance and repair projects. And now they're up in arms because their return on investment is greatly diminished because of all these special assessments and the reserve funding. And again, it's like playing the stock market. You got to have the stomach for it. So if you're going to be investing in condo units in Florida, factor that in, because that may not be the investment for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot more expensive. It is going to be a luxury to be in these buildings now, but they will be a lot safer at the end of the day. I think.
And they will and last longer.
Yeah, we're making moves in the right direction. And I think it'll keep the people who want to fix the building with duct tape and a hammer from being able to control those decisions, because these things will have to be done. They will have to be paid for, and they will have to be done. So I think at the end we will have safer buildings. I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you so much, and we'll edit this. And yeah, we should talk again, because I could get technical and really talk about this stuff, and we could talk about insurance, and we can talk about.
You know your stuff, so it was my pleasure to be on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You too. Thanks, Melissa.
Hi, Donna.
Bye.